Every night, it's the same dream, or part of a dream. He walks into a room. Inside is a young woman on the couch, frozen solid, a thin layer of ice covering her entire body except for the head. She clutches something small in her hand, but he can't make out what it is. She looks at him with pleading eyes and manages to utter, "Please lift me." Before he can take a step towards her, her face turns motionless, and she stops breathing. After this, he wakes up. This had been going on for longer than Lucas William cares to remember. It was unsettling at first, but eventually became more of a nuisance than anything else, often preventing him from resting and gaining energy while asleep. Not that it mattered much. He didn't really have an outlet for energy, being unemployed and without a family or a spouse. He had long ago stopped trying to figure out the meaning of the dream and figured it would eventually just go away if left ignored. He picked up his cell phone and checked for messages. Nothing as usual. His finger felt something rough on the backside of the phone. He turned it around and saw the letters LW scratched onto its corner. His ex-girlfriend Helen had made the markings over a year ago. It might as well have been a decade since then. Those times seemed so distant to him these days. She had said back then that the markings served the double purpose of helping him recognize his phone and remembering that it is indeed a cell phone. Hilarious, he uttered aloud to himself, almost bitterly. He sat on his chair in front of the TV. It was already late, but he figured he could watch something pointless anyway since he had no errand to wake up to in the morning. He was tired, though. The dream had taken its toll. He turned on the TV and settled on a channel showing a thriller about some detective trying to solve a murder. Fair enough, he thought to himself, sat back and tried to relax. Soon his eyes started to feel heavy as he listened to the sounds of the city outside the window. Again, the same dream. It even seemed that the dream looped once, and the events played out twice in exactly the same way in one night. Awake, Lucas still kept his eyes closed and tried to shake off the headache that must have come from seeing the dream twice. He was sitting down and figured he must have fallen asleep in the chair. When he opened his eyes, he let out a vocal exclamation of startlement as he realized he was looking at a steering wheel, the steering wheel of his car. Confused, he looked around and saw that the car had hit a small tree on the side of the road. The road didn't seem very urban. It was a gravel road with a small amount of snow on it. It didn't look like it sees much traffic. Where was he? He didn't have any idea of his whereabouts, although he felt a faint sense of recognition as if he had seen this place before, but couldn't piece together his location or how and why he had ended up there. The tree had sunk about half a meter into the hood of the car, so it seemed like a fair bet that it wouldn't work anymore. He tried turning the car keys anyway, but the engine didn't make a sound. He reached into his pocket to pick up his phone and call for help, but noticed that it was not there. After checking all of his pockets in his pants and coat, he searched the car thoroughly, finding nothing. He never left the house without his phone. He checked his pockets again and found a piece of paper. It was crumpled, although it seemed to have been originally folded once to maybe fit an envelope. To his amazement, Lucas recognized his own handwriting on the paper. It said, "You'll find the house easily as a turning on the right road after the small red wall. You'll know you're on the right track when you see a large rectangular boulder on the right side of the road. It's just a little ways after that, beyond a bridge that crosses the river." He couldn't remember writing this. It started to snow, and he now noticed how cold it really was. The wind was also picking up. He looked around again, trying to get his bearings, and noticed a large rock with almost 90-degree angles on it. It must have been the boulder mentioned in the letter, he thought. The surreality of the scenario baffled him, but he knew he had to find shelter. The letter mentioned a house in the direction of the rock. Lucas started walking, passing the large boulder on his right. He turned to look behind him and stared into the dark taillights of his car. Shaking his head, he continued on toward the unknown. After a few minutes, he came upon a small stone bridge. Judging from the sound, the water was still flowing in the river below. Lucas glanced quickly over the side and saw that the water was indeed flowing, and it seemed that the river was fairly deep, as he couldn't see any rocks breaking the water's surface. For such a short bridge, it was a surprisingly large drop. Suddenly, an odd sense of vertigo came over him. It wasn't the height. He had never been afraid of heights before. He stumbled to his side and leaned onto a stone pole, trying to maintain his stability. He took a step forward toward the end of the bridge and stepped on some broken glass. He was really cursing his luck at this point. Taking a few deep breaths, he continued on over the bridge and regained his sense of equilibrium. He still felt dizzy, but at least he could move forward normally again. He glanced back at the bridge, wondering who had built it, since it didn't look exactly safe. Save for two small poles, one on each side, there wasn't any railing or even much of an edge before the vast nothingness beyond. A shiver went down his spine and reminded him that he should probably keep going to find shelter from the winter that tried to push into his bones so relentlessly. During the journey, Lucas had tried to remember why he had ended up in the car, but the last thing he could recall was sitting in front of the TV. The dizziness didn't help his ability to think clearly, but it seemed to be thankfully fading away. After walking a few more minutes, he saw a house in the distance. The cold was biting his face as the wind circled around him, and he hurried onward. When he reached the front yard, he saw a few sets of tire marks on the ground that had partially been covered by the snow. He didn't see any cars around, though, and dreaded the possibility that no one might be home to let him in. The door looked like a bastion of hope after the ordeal he had just been through, and he walked over to knock on it. There was no answer. "Hello," he yelled, and knocked again and turned the handle almost as a reflex. To his amazement, the door was unlocked and opened. "Anyone home? My car broke down a mile or two back, and... Hello?" There was no answer nor any sign of anyone being home. He took a few steps inside and closed the door, figuring that if someone was home, he could just explain the situation calmly and ask to use the phone or something. He was really exhausted from the events that had transpired moments ago and needed to just take a breath after reaching what at least seemed like safety. Lucas walked forward through a doorway and, without looking, hit the light switch with his left hand to illuminate the place a little. After a few minutes, he had looked through every room of the house, his inquiries of anyone being there echoing around and bouncing from the walls of the vacant house. It wasn't a huge place, one floor consisting of a kitchen, a living room, and a small room between them that linked the two and the front door together. The kitchen also led to the bathroom, which he also checked, just in case someone had fallen asleep in the tub or something and hadn't heard him yelling. The furnishing was pretty basic: tables and chairs in the kitchen, a sofa, and a television in the living room. The place didn't have much of a lived-in feel, no opened mail anywhere or used plates or such. The only signs of life that were immediately apparent were a few rugs that had been pushed out of place in the kitchen and tire tracks outside. After a few minutes of searching, it seemed pretty apparent that there was no phone in the house. He cursed vocally. One would think that any kind of house would have a phone. He weighed his options. It didn't seem like a viable idea to brave the journey outside back to his car and onward from there, since he had no clue how far he would have to journey in the cold before reaching help. Although he figured that the walk would probably be completely survivable, since no place should be that remote, he still didn't feel like risking it, especially since he was now in the comforting warmth of this small building. He felt tired anyway, and the small clock on the wall told him that it was almost 5 p.m., and indeed, it had already gotten fairly dark outside. It seemed like a viable option to just stay here and wait for whoever owned this place to return. Then he could just explain the scenario to the owner, and the situation would resolve itself. Even if the person got scared and called the police, he figured that the end result would place him safely back home eventually anyway. The couch looked very inviting, and the TV just might be the thing to remedy the agitation that plagued his mind after all that had happened. He didn't even take off his coat and just lay down, placing his feet on the armrest. He noticed a remote on the table next to him and turned on the TV. As he put down the remote, he noticed a small piece of paper on the table. He picked it up and turned it over, looking at his own handwriting. "You'll find what you need to know about this place from the basement." His heart skipped a beat, and he stood up so quickly that he almost tripped over the table. How? What the hell is this? He muttered aloud and checked his pockets for any more pieces of paper. There was nothing. He stood there dumbfounded for what seemed like a long time, unsure whether he was going insane or just being the victim of a surreal prank of some sort. Eventually, his curiosity won out. If there's something you need to know, then you'd better damn well find out what it is, he thought, and moved toward the door that he knew led to the basement. He opened the door and flipped on the light switch on the wall. Surprisingly, the light came on. He figured that basements didn't have a big risk of having the bulbs stolen, so maybe that was the reason this place had working light, although it did seem a bit far-fetched. There were stairs leading down into the basement, and a fairly old-looking set of wooden railings to hold onto. He made his way down the creaking steps, turning his head to glance behind him from time to time. This had to be one of the oddest situations of his life, and the surreal aspect didn't sit well with him. It felt almost as if there was some invisible entity that might appear and try to push him down the stairs. But the basement remained deserted as he reached the floor. It was a small room, and he didn't see much in the way of furniture there either. There were a few boxes here and there, and an old-looking fireplace with bricks that were blackened in the interior from all the use they must have seen over the years. His eyes were drawn to an old chest with rusted iron bands around it. He opened the latch and then the lid and saw a bunch of letters inside. There were several letters, all neatly stacked in two piles. A lot of the letters were signed by someone called Emily Williams. He didn't recognize the name, but there was something odd about the letters. After examining a few of them, he realized that they were written to someone called Lucas Williams. This made his heart skip another beat. He hadn't read all of them, but the tone of the letters seemed very affectionate, even loving. He sat down on the floor with a thud and stared at the letters, trying to make sense of the situation. He knew that Emily had to be a relative of his. Maybe that was the reason for his last name appearing on the letters. But who would take the time to write him so many letters, and why would they end up in a chest in the basement of this place? The oldness of the paper, with the first letter dated in 1894, made him feel as if the letters were decades old and somehow related to him in some eerie fashion. They felt too close to his name to be a coincidence. He shook his head and continued reading. The letters spoke of Emily's undying love for him, promising to wait for him to return, and spoke of mundane things like the weather and events in the small town they lived in. There was also talk of how they were to meet at their special place and share secrets. There was nothing concrete enough to deduce a location from. Maybe it didn't matter. He heard a noise from the top of the stairs and turned to look. The light in the basement flickered, and he could see what appeared to be a faint blue light seeping in from the main house. He was almost glad he was in the basement at that point and hurriedly closed the chest and took a few steps back, wondering what on earth was happening now. There was a strange scraping noise from the top of the stairs, almost like something or someone was dragging themselves closer. The hair on his arms stood up, and he could feel his heartbeat pound in his chest as he turned to the door. After a few moments, he didn't see anything coming down and cautiously stepped forward again to the bottom of the stairs. He squinted his eyes and saw a faint blue light in the house. The sound was getting louder. Damn it. Get a grip, Lucas, he thought to himself, and started to make his way up the stairs. Halfway up, he saw the source of the light. A young woman, dressed in period clothing, was crawling slowly toward him. Her head was turned sideways, but her eyes were looking directly at him, with a pleading expression in them. He froze in place, unable to move. "Please lift me," she said weakly. The words sounded hauntingly familiar. It was almost the exact same phrase as in his dream. He took another step back down the stairs, wondering if he had finally lost his mind and was hallucinating. She stopped moving and slowly started to freeze in place, her head now completely turned to him. He didn't know what else to do and took a few steps up, reached out to her hand, and clasped it. As soon as he did, everything around him went dark, and he felt a cold chill enter his bones, and then a sudden snap, like someone was snapping their fingers. He was standing in his living room in front of the TV. He looked around and saw the same dull gray carpet and the same posters on the wall. He felt like someone had just taken him and dropped him here. The sensation was dizzying, but the dizziness seemed to pass quickly. He walked to the bathroom and splashed cold water on his face, trying to wake up and process what had just happened. It all seemed so real, but then again, so did dreams at times. He looked at his face in the mirror and saw that he was holding something small in his hand. He opened his palm and saw an old, rusted key with an ornate handle. It was covered in a thin layer of frost.